My name is Andrew Holt. I'm professor of history at Florida State College at Jacksonville, and today I'm here with my colleague and friend, Dr. Wesley Moody. Dr. Moody is our college's leading Civil War historian. He's a top-level historian of the Civil War, the author of no less than 4 well-received books on the Civil War. Most recently, his fourth book, a most recent book, is titled 7 Myths of the Civil War, and it considers popular understandings of the Civil War and how those popular understandings contrast with scholarly understandings of the same. And so today we're here to talk to Dr. Moody about the myths of the Civil War and about his book, and hopefully gain a better understanding of those issues. So how are you, Dr. Moody?
Very fine. Thank you for having me on your show.
Perhaps we could start with you giving us a sense of your background and how you came to become a historian of the Civil War. What interested you in it, and why did you decide to pursue this course in life?
Well, I've been here at Florida State College at Jacksonville for 10 years now, and why I got involved in history, it's always been a subject that interested me. As a kid, I was always one that read a lot more nonfiction than fiction, and the idea of being able to talk history as a job just doesn't get any better than that. When I did my master's studies, I was American Revolution. And what interested me in the Revolution was, that's the start. That's the foundation of so much of who we are as a country. When I went on to get my PhD, I was at Georgia State in Atlanta, and we lived in a little town called Jonesboro, just outside of Atlanta. And Jonesboro was a battlefield. It was a major battlefield in the campaign right around Atlanta. And it's not a very well preserved battlefield. We used to do our grocery shopping in the middle of the battlefield at the Kroger there. But every day, going to work, going to classes, you're passing the historic markers. General Sherman did this here. This railroad was important because of this. And it drew you in. It was hard to live life and not surrounded by that and not get drug in and become more and more interested in it. And what fascinated me is, as I did research on General Sherman, as I read the books, I looked at the stuff that people wrote contemporary at the time, the records, it didn't really match what you got elsewhere, what you got on History Channel documentaries, what you read in modern books. And that interested me more than just, okay, they're not getting it right, but how did that inaccurate story evolve? And that's led me down a path that's led me to this book, 7 Myths of the Civil War.
Wonderful. And I should mention that book is with Hackett Publishing. How's your experience been in dealing with Hackett?
They're a wonderful press. Recruiting the other authors, it's went much easier because Hackett Press has a very good reputation, and they've been there every step of the way.
We'll come back to your other authors. I'll be interested to hear about them as well. But before we do, let me ask you, it's often said that the victors or the winners, they write the histories. But in the case of the U.S. Civil War, it almost seems the opposite. It seems like the South, which was defeated, has had a much larger voice in framing historical narratives of the Civil War, in arguing reasons for its causes, its justifications, these sorts of arguments. It seems Southerners care a lot more about the history of the Civil War than perhaps you see in the North. What are your thoughts on that? Is that an accurate assumption, or is that?
Well, that is the great cliche that the victors write the history books, and it is definitely different with the American Civil War. There is definitely in most histories a more Southern bent, and even Northern authors, even authors that would never think that they're writing from a Southern point of view, are pushing forward some of these myths that I talk about in the book, or my authors talk about in the book. One of the major reasons for this is, and there are a number of reasons for this. One, when the war ended, the victors, they were the ones that were in charge of the country. The victors had work to do. The victors went on and controlled politics. They had an army to run. Those who lost found themselves unemployed, and thus the time to write the histories. And probably more importantly than that, they had to justify what had happened. They had to explain why they lost, why they fought, and those on the North didn't necessarily have those issues that they had to deal with. I'm not sure if it's true. I've heard this before, that Southerners care more about the Civil War, and I'm not sure if that's true. There are probably more than 10,000 books on Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
I don't think Southerners are reading
Could I
all of those books on Lincoln.
Could I interject real
Yes.
quick, just for a moment? You know, I was born in Pittsburgh. I grew up there as a kid. I never saw people in Pittsburgh driving around with bumper stickers that said the North's going to do it again, or Union flags, or waving those sorts of things. And then when I moved to the South, I encountered that sort of popular paraphernalia quite often in reference to the Civil War. And it seems like you just don't see that sort of spirit as often, at least, in the North as you do in the South. Would you think that's accurate? Or?
It may be simply you don't notice it as much in the North. You notice the Confederate battle flag perhaps a little more than someone with 28 stars on a flag hanging from their house. When the very first time, a personal story here, the very first time I went up north, I met my wife's family up in Wisconsin. One of her uncles had met me before, didn't know what I did for a living. First question out of his mouth was, "Why can't you Southerners get over the Civil War?"
Sure.
At which point I had to say, "Well, you're the one that brought it up. I'm just minding my own business here." Of course, then I had to tell him what I did for a living, and that didn't help my cause.
Sure.
But the only person I know that reenacts, that puts on the uniform and refights the battles, is a Northerner from Wisconsin who always wears the blue.
Yeah.
So I think it's across the field, and it may just be a little more controversial when Southerners are so interested in the Civil War. I have a feeling that if you went to Ohio and you started talking about taking down statues of Ulysses S. Grant, you would have pretty much the same reaction that you would have when they talk about taking down statues in New Orleans or in Memphis of Nathan Bedford Forrest. But it's just not as controversial when you're talking about the victors.
In the wake of the Civil War, many Southerners defeated, demoralized, extraordinary destruction took place in the South as a result of the war. And out of that emerged a Southern narrative that's commonly referred to as the lost cause, which was meant to sort of explain or rationalize the Civil War. Could you explain what the lost cause is and how it emerged, why it emerged? Why did this particular narrative come about?
Well, the term itself comes from a Richmond newspaper editor, Edward Pollard. And Pollard wrote his history of the Civil War. It came out in 1866. And it is the ultimate Southern view of the Civil War. I mean, any question what the lost cause is, you can go right to Edward Pollard. And it was there's a great saying, a modern historian, Van Woodward, who wrote, that Southerners are the only Americans who have been defeated in war and have to live under their occupiers. And that was something we had to deal with. And the lost cause, the explanation of we lost the war, but it wasn't our fault we lost the war. The deck was stacked against us from the beginning, and it was a lost cause from the beginning. There was no chance of winning.
And for what reasons?
Like so that they began spinning that very early on. The North, one of the very much is one of the beginning ones, is the North had this huge manufacturing advantage. That there was just so many. The North had more factories than the South had factory workers, and just that overwhelming, there was no way the South could overcome that. Yeah. And that you'll hear that all the time. One of the problems with that is manufacturing, as we learned in the Second World War, that takes time to get on a military footing. All of those factories that were turning out coats, sewing machines, you name it, changing those factories to make rifles. To get that going full speed, you're talking about a year, 2 years. So the South, quick war, they could have won this, of this idea that it's unwinnable because there's this manufacturing advantage. The new numbers is always a big part of this lost cause. There was so many more Northerners, so many more immigrants they could put into uniform that the South was going to be overwhelmed. They fought hard, they tried their best, but it was a lost cause from the beginning. There was no way that could be won. Once again, it's kind of like manufacturing. That takes time to get going. Men have to be uniformed, men have to be trained. That's a lot of weight. It takes time to bring that to bear. A quick war could have been a Southern victory. So the idea that the South can't win this, and I have my students, we make the comparison, old Revolutionary War historian here. We talk about strengths and weaknesses of the North versus the South, and in my US 1, I ask myself, does that sound familiar? And there'll always be one brave student who says, what? It sounds a little like the American Revolution. And it's like, okay, well, who won that one? Well, the side that had all the disadvantages the South did wins the American Revolution. Yeah. So Southerners, part of the lost cause as well is why they lost. Part of the lost cause as well is why the war was fought. And Southerners, 1865 on, telling their children, their grandchildren what happened, why did we fight this war? Fighting a war to keep men enslaved just wasn't what you wanted to tell your children as they moved on. So the myth begins to emerge of other causes for the Civil War, moving beyond slavery, and that was justification, a big part of this.
We can return back to that issue of slavery and the Civil War in a moment, but before we do that, I want to ask you, getting back to your book, Seven Myths of the Civil War, what do you mean by myth in that context? What is a myth? Maybe you could give us an example of one myth in your book, and why historians would see it that way.
Well, what we mean by myth is it's a misconception that is forwarded to change the narrative. Not just, we make a mistake and oops, they didn't win that battle and we thought we did, but it's a misconception to make the war different and the storyline, the narrative different. I'll talk about one of the chapters in the book is about General Ulysses Grant. Grant is one of the great generals, arguably in American history, and in the last year and a half of the Civil War, he is the one probably most responsible for Union victory, defeating Robert E. Lee, the Army of Northern Virginia, bringing the war to a successful conclusion. One of the myths of the lost cause is that General Robert E. Lee was the great general, and his army was the best army on the American continent. And don't get me wrong, he was a very good general, he had a very good army under him, but the problem is, of course, you say that, someone will respond with, yes, but he lost. He was beaten. Well, yes, but as the myth goes, he wasn't out-generaled. It wasn't that his opponent was a better general and that's why he lost. We had these other factors coming into play. And one of those was the numbers. That Grant just had a larger army, and he wasn't a better general. He just had so many more men that he could just throw them into battle and they would get slaughtered, but eventually it would be so many that the Southern armies would get overwhelmed and you would have Union victory. And so what has emerged is this myth of Grant the Butcher. No concern with his own men, they're just cannon fodder, as the old saying goes. And that, we have a very good author, Ed Bonekemper, that talks about the myth in the book. And what he argues is the numbers don't match that. That when you start looking at Grant's losses, they're very comparable to Lee. And he doesn't get as much into this, but this gets back to your earlier question. Uh, why are Southerners kind of dominating this narrative? Well, Grant, 1868, Grant's president of the United States. Grant is a little busy to be writing journal articles and letters to the editor of defending his generalship. He had a nation to run. He had to worry about the French in Mexico, this type of thing. So that's one example of a myth.
Okay. Well, I feel like we should go back to the slavery issue since we've discussed the lost cause, since we brought up the slavery issue, and since we're talking about myths. I will sometimes hear people in the South, even students have told me before, suggested at the beginning of class, that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. It was all about states' rights or something like that. How would you respond if a student were to make that statement in your class?
Well, I get asked that a lot,
Sure.
and I'll have people come up to me, friends, they find out what I do for a living, and they'll ask me, so which is it? Was the Civil War about slavery, or was it about states' rights? Yeah. And my response is generally, I don't care for multiple choice questions. I don't do an A and B. I mean, what we're talking about is a country of millions, and lots of men took up arms, fought. It's a lot more complicated than A or B. But to simplify it and to talk about slavery versus states' rights, very good saying, a little bit of a joke, but at the very beginning of the war, if you asked any Northerner what the war was about, they said it was Union. It was preserving the Union. It was keeping the country together, preserving democracy. And if you ask any Southerner in 1861 what the war was about, very clearly this was a war about slavery. This is a war to preserve the institution of slavery, preserve our way of life. Now, by the time you get to 1865, you ask the same people, and the question, Northerners will say this is a war about slavery. This was a war to set men free. And Southerners will say the opposite. No. This was a war about a Southern nation. This was a war about states' rights.
Quite a reversal.
It switches very quickly in a 4-year period.
It's very interesting. Well, tell us about the authors that you recruited. You mentioned one earlier that you recruited to write because I should explain that this book is an edited volume where you are the editor and you wrote the 7th chapter, the introduction, and then you recruited 6 other top-level historians to address other myths. Could you just very briefly explain the 7 myths that are considered in your book and who you recruited and what sort of experiences you had doing this?
It's a much easier process to recruit people to write for you than it is to write yourself.
Sure.
I found that out. When I came up with the ideas of the myths first, I looked at this kind of volume. I looked at earlier volumes in the set, 7 Myths of the Crusades, to kind of get the idea of what we were looking for. And the 7 I chose, there are others I could have done. I mean, there's other bigger myths that deserve a book to themselves and have books to themselves. But I chose the myths, and right away I got very lucky. A couple of friends I have are the leading experts on that subject, so that worked out very well. One of the myths that the book talks about is the myth of Civil War prisons. And several movies, TNT did Andersonville, that type of thing. And the truth of the matter, when you talk about Civil War prisons, these were horrible things. Neither side was prepared for the number of prisoners of war they were going to have to deal with. And there was mass death, there was starvation, and you have 2 separate myths that emerge. One is that the South did the best they could with what they had. They had shortages of food, they had shortages of supplies, and the prisoners suffered, as did all Southern civilians. The North, however, with plenty of resources, that type of thing, was intentionally cruel to their prisoners. Yeah. And then, of course, the reverse myth is the Northern myth that Southerners were intentionally cruel and the North did the best they could. They just weren't prepared for the number of prisoners they were having to deal with. And a friend of mine, Dr. Ben Cloyd, educated at Louisiana State University, wrote a book, Haunted by Atrocity, And he talks about the formation of the myths, and he tracks it down from, where it began to where we are now. The National Museum of Prisoners of War at Andersonville in Georgia, and a number of the issues they have there. So that was an easy one. That was an easy phone call to make. As well, put my notes here. I have a friend of mine, Barton Myers. I gave a presentation with
a big name.
Very early on,
Sure.
yes, in my career.
Yeah.
We were both graduate students, and he's at Washington and Lee University now, named to where General Robert E. Lee was the president of at the end of the war, and it's a place that takes their Civil War history, very seriously. So to be their Civil War professors, it's quite a nod. And his book, make sure I get the title there, Rebels Against the Confederacy, but he talks about the guerrilla war. And one of the myths that emerges, we see it in movies, you've seen Gettysburg or Gods and Generals. There's this idea that the Civil War was Gettysburg. It was Antietam. It was a battle fought by uniformed men, a war fought by uniformed men in battles, everything organized, everything lined up. And what he looks at is, no, it wasn't. Those battles, of course, existed, they were, but at the same time, you had this brutal, ugly war that happened throughout the nation. You had guerrilla, partisan warfare. You had civilians being murdered by other civilians, cities burnt down. It was a civil war. It wasn't just a organized military conflict. And Dr. Myers deals with that very well. A very difficult subject to bring down into a chapter. One of the biggest names that I was able to get for the book is Brooks Simpson. Yeah. Arizona State University. He's the name most people recognize as a Civil War historian. And a little bit of luck getting Brooks Simpson to write for me. Sure. His chapter it's an emerging myth. Most of the myths we talk about started, they were Edward Pollard, 1865, but in the last decade, there are new myths that are emerging. And Brooks Simpson's is one of those, and that's the myth of Black Confederates. And the idea that, reason that groups like Sons of Confederate Veterans like the idea that there were Black Confederates is if you're making the argument, this is not a war about slavery, there was other issues here. Well, if we had black men fighting for the Confederacy, how can you possibly argue that it was about slavery? Why would they fight to keep themselves in slavery? And there's been a great deal written about it. The internet is, type in Black Confederates and you get the phone book thrown back at you.
There was a controversial moment, sorry to interject, but Burger King locally here in the Jacksonville area put out a calendar not too long ago, I think, and it referred to Black Confederates.
Yes.
I think it was just a local situation. It wasn't the corporate brand or whatever, but it caused a bit of a controversy, I think, for emphasizing Black Confederates.
Yeah, it was a couple of months dedicated to Black Confederates, and it definitely did. It probably didn't cause as much of a local stir as it should have, and part of it, there are Black Southerners that like the idea, and that looked at that calendar and what they're looking for, and not reading minds or anything, but I think what they're looking for is participation. This was not a war fought over us. This was a war we participated in. So I don't know if they're thinking that one completely through.
There were some Black Confederates, though, right? Is that correct? Or?
The idea of the myth is that there was organized Confederate regiments. There was men that put on uniform, and there were men that fought. What we have is, you were talking about a country. We've got a slave system here in the South, and they're working the land. They're servants, and so when you go off to war, you take your servant with you.
Yeah.
And so there was black men in the Confederate Army.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were recruited,
Sure.
that they enlisted. It's not
Or enthusiastically signed up to,
enthusiastic
sure,
about
of
it.
course,
I mean,
yeah.
you go with the owner, and you go with the owner. Well, the wife might be home at the plantation.
Yeah.
That's going to affect how you behave when you're on the battlefront.
Yeah.
Also, one thing to think about is if you're an African American here in 1861, you don't know how this is going to turn out.
Yeah.
Nobody knows how this is going to turn out.
Yeah.
So you don't throw in one way or the other.
Yeah.
You wait and see whose interests serves you best.
Yeah.
So there are those. There are servants, and a lot of those servants post-Civil War, when we start talking about Confederate pensions, they will put in for their pension.
Yeah.
And there's great poverty in the South after the Civil War. And when the Southern states start giving away pensions in the 1870s, the 1880s, these men are desperately poor.
Sure.
I mean, they'll say anything
Yeah.
to get a pension. Yes, I served proudly with Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Yeah.
Where's my check? And
Sure.
I don't think you could knock them for that.
Yeah.
So there are, on the pension records, there are black Confederates. We do see pictures of,
And
blacks.
Simpson's chapter addresses all
Addresses
these
those,
nuances.
addresses the
and,
pictures, addresses the
yeah.
nuances.
Interesting. Yeah.
The Grant chapter,
Sure.
I mentioned that already.
Yeah.
I looking for an author to do Grant.
Uh-huh.
I contacted the Grant Presidential Library in Starkville, Mississippi, the Mississippi State University,
Yeah.
and they were very nice. They recruited Mr. Bone Kemper to write this one for me,
Uh-huh.
so that was one of the easiest ones. And it worked so well that when I was looking for someone for a Lincoln chapter, I contacted the Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, Illinois, and hoping they would put me onto somebody, they would send me a name. Instead, their historian, their head researcher, Ian Hunt, excited about the idea, agreed to write the chapter for me.
Wonderful.
And this is, the Lincoln myth is another one that's relatively new, or at least one that's, I guess it's been around for a while, but it's starting to get a little more traction. And that was that Lincoln didn't care about the slaves, Lincoln was a racist, and he was just doing what he had to do to win the war, and slaves in the end benefited from that.
All he was worried about was preserving the Union
Right.
regardless of slavery.
And Hunt, he deals with it pretty well. I mean, he goes back into the sources, and he portrays Lincoln as an abolitionist. I mean, as a man from a very young age, born in Kentucky, seen the institution of slavery, did not like it, saw it as an evil, but is a politician. And as a politician, elected into the House of Representatives, eventually President of the United States, he couldn't walk into the White House on the first day, sign a proclamation, and slavery's done. It's a little more complicated than that, and that's what Lincoln does. And as a politician, you say certain things to certain groups, certain things to others. And if you go through Lincoln's speeches and you cut them to pieces, you can present him as pretty much anything you want to. And you could probably do that with any modern politician. So Hunt shows him definitely as an abolitionist, as a man that thought slavery was wrong and does more than anybody else in the institution.
And that's the prevailing scholarly view. All of these scholars are reflecting current scholarship on these issues, right? The dominant current scholarship.
They've all written books that have been extremely well reviewed.
Yeah. Even though a lot of what they're claiming is in
Right.
contrast to popular views. So.
Very few of them are going to get invitations to speak at Sons of Confederate Veterans meetings,
Sure.
but they are very well respected in
Yeah.
their field, and they're not putting forward anything radical
Yeah.
by historian standards, at least. We were lucky enough as well to get Michael Bernath down from the University of Miami, and he writes the big chapter, I argue, one that's probably, we talk about slavery, the issue is always slavery versus states' rights. And Bernath makes the argument that you really can't, the problem with the states' rights issues is once we started talking about the war, once it started beginning, Southerners, especially those that were what we call the fire eaters, the ones that were really pushing for the South to leave the Union, they weren't talking about a Republic of South Carolina. They weren't talking about a Republic of Florida. They were talking about a Southern nation. That was what their main interest was. They meet in Montgomery. They create a new Confederate Constitution that holds the Union together much tighter than anything the United States government does. So that the idea this was about states' rights, the lie is kind of put to that very quickly because they're much more interested in a Southern nation.
Yeah. Okay, well, what chapters in your book, Wes, do you think will be the most controversial? Because it sounds like your authors and you yourself, because you write one of the chapters as well on Sherman, which is your specialty, his March to the Sea. But of all of them, it sounds like all of them will be controversial in one way or another. Which two do you think, just to give us two examples, would be some of the more controversial ones, and who would they likely upset the most?
If you asked me when I first started putting this book together, when I first started recruiting authors, I would have had a different answer. But now that it's in the final stages, I've talked to people, the chapters that have gotten the most interest, and what it seems like, I don't know when the change started coming, but the chapters that deal with why the Civil War happened. So the Black Confederate chapters will be very, very controversial. The chapter about Lincoln, because that speaks to why the war happened, that will be a very controversial one. States' rights, that will be a very controversial one. I think all the chapters that deal with why the war began would be the most controversial. And
they're not so much controversial among scholars of the Civil War, though, right? This is sort of
among the general public, yes.
Just with the general. So there's that scholarly popular divide, right?
Correct.
That you're highlighting in the book. Okay, and so those are three examples. Then I guess my final question for you here is why is it important to dispel myths about the Civil War? Why did you feel like you needed to do this book? Why did those authors, why did they respond so enthusiastically to your request to join them in this effort?
We use history. History is a tool, and if you're a student, of course, you're required to take history. And the idea, and I very much believe, is you know what happened before us, and it gives us an understanding of why people do what they do, why our institutions that exist, and you make decisions as you move forward based on your ideas of what's happened in the past. And if that is based on things that are not accurate, things that are not true, then it's like having a faulty owner's manual to a car. You may be going in the wrong direction, basing it on what you believe, and it's simply not true. And there's also, the longer this sits, kind of like concrete drawing, it gets to a point, it's told, it's retold, and it becomes accepted. Because there's even some of the myths that we talk about in this book, and as historians we are, I would argue, very overly specialized. I am a specialist in you think about the entire history of the world, and I am a specialist in a 4-year period, one conflict, and not only that one conflict, the Western aspect of that conflict. So we definitely perhaps over-specialize. And one of the dangers, one of the ways these myths come, is if something is put out there and there's some great historians that writing their narrow little piece of history, when they widen out and talk about the big picture, they accept some of these myths because they've seen it written, and they're not doing the archival work because it's just, you know, a side statement. And once you have a big name put a myth into a publication, then it becomes accepted. Others will take it, and that's their footnote. You have this big name said it, even though it's out of a specialty area. Yeah. That's good enough. So if they're not addressed in a general way like this, it does have its way of cementing itself in place, and it may be too late at some point.
I hate to bring this up. The science fiction analogy I've once heard you use, I think it's an interesting one. Would you mind sharing it?
I won't give the name of the movie because it was a really bad movie, and it's a common cliche science fiction kind of thing where they were time traveling, and by time traveling they were messing things up, and they were having to go back and fix them. And what they were saying was
they were messing up the future by
messing up the
traveling to
future
past,
by fooling around with the past, exactly. And what they would say all the time in this movie is that the timeline is like concrete. And if it sets, there's nothing you can do about it. So we have to act fast before it sets. So history is, the writing of history is that way. If we let it set, it becomes too accepted. You know, the historian that is getting his PhD, what he learned in elementary school tends to stick. So if we let it sit too long, it'll have an effect on future generations, and we get bad history.
Yeah. Well, that concludes our discussion tonight with Dr. Moody, who I want to thank very much for doing this, for having this talk. And I also want to thank Professor Isaac Brown and his wonderful students who have helped us put this production together tonight. Thank you very much.